All right, let's talk about a word you hear all the time. But what does it really mean? Atheism. Today we're going to break it down, get past the noise, and look at what it is, where the arguments come from, and its long, fascinating history. So let's just jump right in with this really provocative quote from way back in the 18th century. Baron Dahlbach is basically saying that atheism isn't something you choose to become, it's our natural starting point before anyone teaches us about religion. It's a powerful way to frame this whole conversation, suggesting it's an absence of belief, not a rejection.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start by nailing down a definition. Then we'll get into the big arguments. After that, a quick trip through history, a look at where things stand today across the globe, and we'll wrap up by tackling that huge topic, ethics. Okay, first things first. Before we can even get into the debates or the history, we have to be on the same page. What are we actually talking about when we use the word atheism? You know, it's actually a bit more nuanced than most people think. So, at its absolute core, the simplest, broadest definition of atheism is just this: an absence of belief in gods or deities. Notice it doesn't say a belief that there are no gods. It's about the lack of belief. But of course, we can break this down even further.
And this is where it gets really interesting. You have two main types. Implicit atheism is what our friend Baron de Holbach was talking about. A newborn, or someone from a culture with no concept of gods, doesn't believe simply because they've never even considered the question. Explicit atheism is what most of us picture. Someone who has thought about it, considered the claims, and consciously decided, nope, I don't believe that.
And we can slice it another way, which is super important for understanding the argument. Negative atheism is a position of non-belief. It's saying, I do not hold a belief that any gods exist. It's a passive stance. Positive atheism, on the other hand, is an active claim about reality. It's saying, I believe that no gods exist. See the difference? One is a lack of belief, the other is a belief in a lack.
Okay, so now that we've got our definition straight, let's get into the why. People don't typically land on these positions out of nowhere. There's a long history of philosophical arguments that underpin atheistic thought.
This is maybe the big one, the problem of evil. It's an ancient puzzle posed here by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. It's a logical trap, right? If you have a God that is supposed to be all-powerful and all-good, how do you explain the existence of evil and suffering in the world? It poses a serious challenge, and it's a question people have been wrestling with for thousands of years.
So, beyond just looking for contradictions, other thinkers have tried to explain why religion exists in the first place. Some, like Feuerbach and Freud, said it's basically psychology. We invent gods to cope with fear and desire. From a sociological angle, Karl Marx famously argued religion was a tool used by the powerful to keep the poor in their place. And then you have libertarians like Bakunin, who saw the very idea of God as being fundamentally opposed to human freedom.
Let's switch gears and jump into the history. You might think of atheism as a pretty modern phenomenon, but the reality is the seeds of unbelief are ancient. It has a really long and complicated story.
I mean, look at this timeline. You had philosophers in ancient Greece openly questioning the gods. And here's a fun fact. The Romans actually called the first Christians atheists because they refused to worship the Roman pantheon. While these ideas were pretty rare in medieval Europe, they were alive and well in the Islamic Golden Age. Then the Enlightenment in the 18th century is when you see the first openly self-proclaimed atheists in the West. That really kicked things into high gear for the 19th and 20th centuries, with thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche, leading all the way up to the modern new atheism movement that emerged in the 2000s.
So that brings us right up to today. After all that history, what does the world actually look like now when it comes to atheism? Let's take a look at the numbers.
Globally, if you ask people if they are an atheist, the number that says yes is pretty small, around 2%, according to this survey. But that single number is incredibly misleading because it's not evenly spread out at all, not even close. And this is exactly what I mean. When you zoom in, the picture changes dramatically. A poll of convinced atheists found staggering numbers in some countries. Look at China at nearly 50%. Japan isn't far behind. You also see very high rates in some parts of Europe, like the Czech Republic. So it's a phenomenon that's highly concentrated in certain regions.
Now, what about the United States? The percentage is smaller, yeah, but what's really striking here is the trend. The number of self-identified atheists nearly doubled in just 7 years. That's a really rapid change in a country's religious makeup.
So who are these people? Well, sociologists have found some interesting patterns. Now remember, correlation isn't causation, but they found that, on average, atheism tends to correlate positively with things like higher education levels, greater economic security, and even a more analytical, as opposed to intuitive, way of thinking.
And that brings us to our final and maybe the most hotly debated topic of all. For centuries, one of the biggest criticisms leveled against atheism has been about morality. It all boils down to one simple but incredibly profound question.
This question, which you'll find in the heart of great literature like Dostoevsky's novels, really gets to the core of it. Is a divine being necessary for morality to exist? If you take away the ultimate lawmaker, do all the laws just crumble? Does right and wrong lose all meaning?
The argument's really split into two camps. On one side, you have the idea that without God, there's no objective basis for morality. Murder is wrong is only true because God declared it so. But the counter-argument, which goes all the way back to Plato, flips that around. It asks, is something good just because God says it is? Or does God say it's good because it's inherently good? If it's the latter, then you don't actually need God to figure out what's moral.
And we'll leave you with this final thought-provoking quote from Sam Harris. His point is, well, we don't have a special word for people who don't believe in Zeus or for people who aren't astrologers, right? The word atheist only exists because belief in a god is treated as the default position. And that leaves us with a question. What if disbelief isn't a worldview to be defended, but just the default state of a mind that hasn't been given a good enough reason to believe?